Great, thank you. Well, then we can
And then
start.
they are sorted alpha by first name.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Holly Stallworth. I'm the designated federal officer for the BenMAP and Benefits Methods panel. This is an ad hoc panel of the EPA Science Advisory Board. The SAB is a chartered Federal Advisory Committee Act committee, and it is empowered by law to provide advice to the EPA administrator. This panel's report would be reviewed by the chartered SAB and approved before it is transmitted to the EPA administrator. I, as the designated federal officer, am responsible that we comply with FACA and EPA policy, and that includes the requirement for advance public notice. And this meeting was advertised in the Federal Register. I will be taking the notes to summarize our discussion and action items, and that will be presented to the panel chair, Dr. Schindel, as minutes, which he will approve, and then they will be posted on our meeting website. Speaking of our website, if you're watching this on YouTube, you've probably found your way around our website, but if not, you can find the draft report at epa.gov/SAB. Click on today's date, May 16th, and look under draft reports. It's like a 75-page PDF, and that will be the subject of today's discussion. Finally, I wanted to comment on the status of this committee's compliance with federal ethics laws. The SAB staff office has reviewed information relevant to conflict of interest and determined there are no such issues for any of the panelists participating in this review. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, please send me an email so I can record your 75-page PDF. And that would be the subject. It seems to be like a delayed feedback. Anyway, if you're watching this on YouTube, please send me an email so I can record your participation in the minutes, and that includes the EPA people. I'll turn the meeting now over to our chair, Dr. Schindel.
You're muted. Drew, you're muted.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, everybody, and it's great to see the bulk of our review panel here. I know we have at least one who's had a power issue and will be joining us shortly, but it looks like the majority of our team are here, so that's terrific. And as you heard from Holly, the draft review, the PDF is 75 pages, so we've clearly been busy, and thank you all for your contributions in getting this document together. So today, what the goal is to go over the draft document to discuss remaining substantive issues. We're not going to discuss things like, punctuation and grammar. We can flag those things for clarity going back, but we really want to go over the issues where it's useful and valuable to have this team together of the panel for discussion of. And secondly, we want to ensure that we have had a chance to reach a panel consensus on the recommendations that really are the one of the main goals of this panel is to provide concrete actionable steps, which are arranged according to priority levels so that the EPA can move forward and take our advice on board. The one other thing I want to kind of call to everybody's attention, perhaps, is that there is something we haven't really done yet, despite having past 75 pages in our draft. And at least for the academics, if you think of when you get a review or you write yourself a review for a journal article, you don't generally just jump straight into here's my detailed 20 comments on this line and this line and this line, but an overarching opinion of what we think of it is what we do for a paper. And I think that would be very valuable for EPA in this context as well, is to provide some general feedback that kind of is a introduction to our more specific detailed comments. What is our opinion of both the current methodology for benefits valuation and the BenMAP tool as a whole, right? And so that EPA will have some signal of what we think of the general construction of both of those areas that we're asked to comment on, in addition to all of the very, very specific details. So we can try to put that language together. We don't have to go into details of, specific sentences that we would write and such, but it would be also useful to get a sense of our opinion of, should they be tossing out BenMAP and starting entirely over with a different way of looking at benefits, or do we think that, hey, this is a pretty good thing? So again, think of something like a paper. Is this a needs minor revisions but should be accepted pending revision style thing, or is this a line of work that the author should drop? We haven't really given that kind of feedback, so let's try to add that in as well. That's really all I wanted to say for the introduction. Again, thank you everybody for some really insightful and engaging discussions over the past several weeks. It's been very interesting, at least for me, to learn a lot of new work that I wasn't available or wasn't aware of, and to really see that and try to get that all together into the draft. So maybe if there are no other general comments about procedure or the goals of today's meeting, we could just go ahead and start with going through the charge questions. Oh, I did forget to mention one thing, which is, of course, what we want to do with the recommendations once we have them distilled into these tiers and priority levels, is that we also create a summary, which is a very short executive summary style thing of the top recommendations, which goes into the letter, which we're trying to keep around 3 pages, which will go to the administrator. So that's another agenda item for the day, is to try, as we go through the questions, to figure out which things should be really elevated to the letter to the administrator.
And
Holly,
Drew, we were gonna hear from Dr. Pete Maniloff in OAQPS, who has some feedback on our draft.
Terrific.
In fact, that was on our meeting agenda for the next item before we walk through the whole report.
That sounds great. Okay, so why don't we do that now, unless I don't see any hands raised, or no, I do see a hand raised. Sorry, maybe Jonathan, do you want to?
Yeah, just a quick question for the charge questions that we don't have a bolded recommendation. Do we have to come up with a bolded recommendation for like the last few questions?
Well, part of the reason, some of the material, unfortunately, the deadlines and the timing for this particular review panel for many of the academics aligned with the end of the semester. So it's a bit of a challenge for us to get all of the material in. So for the first, you're right, Jonathan, and that's a good point. For the first 5, the more general approach to evaluation of benefits, we have bolded recommendations, which I can reiterate what I said in emails, were something that's largely draft text that I put in and is very much open for discussion about both what goes in those bolded recommendations and the tier prioritization. For the 5 last questions, all related to BenMAP, we don't have them currently. I think that's an excellent question for the panel, is do we want to adopt the same kind of structure and have bolded recommendations? I think we don't necessarily want to try to pile all of those into the 3-page letter to the administrator, because that will get very rapidly far beyond 3 pages. But if there is a good way to summarize the conclusions from the BenMAP discussion, I don't think it's, maybe Holly, do you want to weigh in on that? It's not obligatory for us, is my understanding.
Yeah, I don't think we necessarily have to have a bolded recommendation for each charge question.
Yeah, I think those last ones don't, lots of them are just comment on rather than asking questions. So I'm fine without them. I was just asking.
Okay,
But as we go through and discuss them, if something comes up, then of course we can consider it. The panel can consider it.
okay, and that might be something, don't want to put you on the spot, but it might be something, Pete, that you'll also comment on as far as how you would like the recommendations related to BenMAP as specifically, since we haven't really got to that yet. Thanks for bringing that up, Jonathan. Why don't we turn it over then to Pete?
Sure.
you.
So thanks, Dr. Chanel. And first, thanks to the panel for all of your work. It shows like this was a lot of work, and we recognize that it lined up with the end of the semester, and a lot of experience and expertise behind the work, and that all showed. That wasn't actually one of my comments, but I have 4 requests for clarification for our use for staff. So the first one actually is a second, Dr. Chandel's suggestion of a summary. And I'd like to suggest that the panel particularly consider a summary with respect to the BenMAP program's fitness for regulatory analysis. So I think that, sort of reading this as I would, a review, I think that the SAB the panel would consider BenMAP to be fit for regulatory analysis, just like the analytically equivalent BenMAP CE is used now, but with a lot of suggested improvements and extensions, both for future EPA efforts and to support the research community. If that's a fair assessment, we would appreciate the SAB. Well, either way, we would appreciate the SAB clearly stating whether it's the case that the panel considers BenMAP fit for regulatory analysis or not. And in the latter case, we would appreciate the SAB clearly stating what would the panel believes would make it so. Okay. So second point was on or request, I think, the idea of combining risk estimates. So I think a summary could fairly be that the panel believes the agency should combine risk estimates from multiple epidemiologic studies in order to reduce the uncertainty in those estimates. And this can be done by pooling risk estimates or meta-analyses or other methods like Mansky's credible intervals, right? And there were a couple of examples, illustrative examples. If I understand that correctly, then I'd like to ask for an additional guidance on that. And so we've historically reported the number of PM attributable deaths by using hazard ratios from multiple cohort studies. And that was done as a means of characterizing uncertainty associated with the PM mortality relationship, right? And the risks in these the risk estimates in these studies differed for a variety of reasons, including that they use different cohorts, different particle compositions, different time activity patterns, other differences also. And combining estimates would reduce, would sort of mask that heterogeneity that we're currently using as an illustrative way to measure, to demonstrate uncertainty. And so would the committee also be able to provide pros or cons for combining or not combining, or the different methods of combining? Okay, the third suggestion is on the TSP and PM10. So the EPA has historically estimated effects using both PM10 and PM2.5 studies. This was in the past, and this was principally because of the then limited body of PM2.5 epi studies. So we think this is no longer the case, and that we're no longer limited this way, and we're now better able to characterize a broad array of PM2.5 attributable effects just due to advances in the literature. So are there specific endpoints that we're not currently quantifying that the panel believes we could quantify if we were to use PM10 or PM2.5? And if we were to do that, could you elaborate on how we could do so without double counting effects, particularly, of PM2.5 being a subset of those? And then my fourth question is about the shared socioeconomic pathways. So there's several places where the report recommends that the agency explore or move toward using alternative data sources for projections and names the SSPs as a possible, right? This would, benefits could include transparency and the well understood and well validated alternative scenarios. So we could then do scenario analysis as part of an uncertainty analysis. So I have two questions about using these. So the first is that my understanding is that the SSPs are available at 1/8 of a degree resolution standardly. And we currently perform analyses on a 12 by 12 kilometer grid, and that's a similar spatial scale in the continental US. But I think there's interest in the EPA shifting to a smaller spatial scale. You know, a kilometer grid, a 1 kilometer grid was discussed at the previous meeting. My understanding is that a number of research groups have developed downscaling methods for population and for other parameters, but that there's commonly agreed upon best practice on how to do that, right? This is a currently active research frontier, I think, with a number of groups providing different downscale data products. And so I'd like to ask if the SAB could provide pros or cons of different downscaling methods to help the agency choose between methods or products and how we might choose them. And then one more question on the SSPs is, at time, we'll need projections of multiple parameters, right? Such as population and baseline mortality and perhaps income at whatever spatial scale we're using. So can the council or can the panel provide advice on if there are complexities or things we need to be aware of or preferred methods of getting parameters from different research groups and different efforts? If these are all downscaled as a part of the same coherent research project, great. But if they are downscaled by different research groups, we'd like to ensure that they're consistent with each other in some way. Or do we need to do that? Can the panel provide counsel on how we could combine these? So those 4 suggestions, a summary, the advice on pooling or combining, PM10 and TSP, and the SSPs. So that's all I had. Yes, otherwise, yeah, thank you for all of your work thus far.
Thank you, Dr. Manilow. That's very useful. Okay, so we have, I guess, plenty to do. It's a good thing we have a relatively long meeting today. A lot of things to cover. Holly, should we? I'm forgetting with too many screens open on the agenda. Is there anything else before we just kind of jump in?
We just jump in, walk through the report.
Okay, wonderful. Great. So why don't we begin with first question? Unless anybody has any alternative proposals, I would suggest we just go through the charge questions 1 through 10 and in order and get people's opinions. We had asked the panel to look over the draft, and we saw lots of people making comments, so I know many of you did at least. And then to kind of flag for discussion things that you wanted to bring up. So I know that several of you have mentioned specific things in email traffic, so I know we'll get to them, but otherwise, if there are things I don't know about, I can give a little introduction to each one. Or actually, we were going to ask the people who were, now I remember. Yes, we were going to ask the people who had led each particular charge question. We're probably even better placed to give a little bit of an introduction. So, BenMAP assignments. There we go. Okay, so I have the right document available now. And for charge question 1, for the first 2 parts, A and B, so we'll begin with A, that would be Matthew Needell, who I think I saw earlier.
I'm here.
Ah, there you are. Yes, it's hard to find people on this gallery of many. I would say rogues, but I'm going to be polite, not say rogues gallery. Okay, so Matthew, if you would be so kind, if you're willing to introduce us to 1A, and then we can see if the panel as large has questions or comments.
Great. And I guess the intent here is for me to be fairly brief because we have all of the details in front of us. So I guess I'm really just reading kind of the summary paragraph in the beginning of the charge question. Is that the idea?
I think it would be probably most valuable to indeed give a very brief summary, but also feel free to raise any questions that you as the lead discussant for this particular issue think that might be worth the panel going over and spending a few minutes on.
Got it. All right. So looking at charge question 1A, three main recommendations came out for thinking about additional health endpoints, epi studies, and risk estimates. The first one was thinking about including studies from countries outside the US and Canada. As people may remember, this conversation came up that currently BenMAP only uses studies from US and Canada. We thought there could be several studies from Europe that could be useful for including. And we gave some suggestions on how to think about including those studies. Studies that might have more comparable characteristics, health systems, pollution levels would be a useful thing to include. That was a tier 1 recommendation. A tier 2 recommendation was to think about including additional impacts that might be labeled as suggestive in the ISA. The thought was that many of those impacts could in fact be happening. It's just the evidence hasn't really been conclusive, but certainly they could be very important impacts, or as conclusive as we'd like. And one thought was to think about including ones that had the highest monetary value, and to sort of dig a little bit deeper into using those studies. And then another tier 2 recommendation was thinking about including additional health endpoints. And there we thought there were some additional health endpoints on outcomes, such as pharmaceutical usage, and other things that may not be captured in traditional studies that have been done so far. And we thought that those might be worth including as well. I'd say where there might be outstanding questions is thinking about, are there more health endpoints that we want to think about including? Because we do have some non-health outcomes that we're talking about including in charge question 5, but the question is, are there more kind of health endpoints other than pharmaceutical use that we might want to think about including? And then the other thing is just thinking about, suggestive studies. How do we think about prioritizing them? How do we think about giving kind of concrete guidance on how to include some of those more suggestive studies? And some of this also crosses charge questions where, at least, some people in our group thought that in some of the more traditional epidemiological studies, maybe the evidence was more suggestive, but possibly in studies outside of epidemiological literature, the evidence was a little bit more concrete, and maybe that wasn't included in the ISA for those reasons. So that's something that comes up in I think question 1B. So those were the three main points, and I'd say the two kind of potentially outstanding things to think about.
Terrific. Thank you for the summary, Matthew. And I suppose this could be another place or a place to consider the point that Pete just brought up, that if one were to consider epi studies based on PM10, would you potentially have different endpoints that you potentially additional endpoints you might want to include? So anybody else on the panel have thoughts about either generally some of these issues or more specifically the three recommendations that are currently in bold at the top there and their prioritization, as one of them being tier 1 and the other two being tier 2? That's open for discussion.
I guess the thought that jumps to my mind immediately is whether we want to offer any opinion about the criteria that EPA uses to include studies. Now that we're broadening our scope to include studies outside of Canada and the US, do we agree that the current criteria that EPA uses is appropriate for selecting those studies? Or do we want to offer any modifications on that? Any guidance needed for EPA there?
Yeah, that's a fair question, Mike. I don't, there was something, I guess that's definitely in this one. Charge question 1A is the EPA's approach to identifying the endpoints to quantify in the studies to draw inferences.
Well, the next charge question 1B asks about minimum and preferred criteria for selecting EPI studies.
Okay, so maybe we will keep that in mind, and perhaps if we, well, it seems like we have essentially agreed that one of our highest priority recommendations for 1A then is including additional countries. I don't hear any objections for that, or studies from other parts of the world. So then Mike's point about, does that change the criteria at all? Why don't we table that for the moment and return to that for 1B? It seems that I'm not hearing any suggestion to change any of the recommendations themselves, or their ordering or the prioritization for 1A. So I think we can take the lack of consent by silence or something, non-contest, no contest implies that everybody's okay with that. And, you know, we can return to that after the meeting if anybody thinks further about it. But for the moment, we seem good with 1A then. So, okay, why don't we go on to 1B? I think if we count all of the subparts, we probably have on the order of 40 questions to get through. So no need to dawdle. Why don't, for 1B,
That's me again.
yeah, that's you. Okay, there, I see. Something has slightly happened to my my copy on the screen, and for a moment I couldn't see the bold parts at the top, but that's because it starts with a plain font text. Okay, so over to you, Matt, please.
And I'll start on 1A, and Rob and Jonathan and I had a kind of side conversation on one of the points there. So I'll address it briefly and see if they have anything to add on that. I think they have a little more expertise, at least on the second suggestion. So this was about minimum and preferred criteria. And I think we had two suggestions, one being a tier 1 and one kind of more tier 3 exploratory. And this also relates to Pete Meneloff's question about using studies that look at TSP and PM10. So what we thought was an important recommendation was the minimum criteria could also include studies that do one of two things. Either they find a reduced form health effect of a policy change. That's one thing, or that they found a relationship between TSP or PM10 and a health effect. And the thought was that both of those could including those could broaden the scope of studies that get included. I'll come back to that in a little more detail, and let me just mention the other recommendation was just thinking about different PM 2.5 components, and currently EPA in the BenMAP is saying we're going to treat all PM 2.5 the same, and our thought was that made sense, but to continue keeping an eye on that as the literature is evolving, because that evidence, it could change over time. But we thought right now that was generally a fine recommendation. In terms of the TSP and PM10, and Pete, getting straight to your question, the thought there was that when you tend to see effects on TSP and PM10 that you wouldn't see for PM2.5 for when they are studies that involve more long-term or in particular latent effects from exposure. There have been some recent studies that look at somebody's exposure to TSP in the in utero period and what happens to their outcomes as an adult when they're 30, 40, 50 years old. And naturally that can't be done with PM 2.5 yet, because the PM 2.5 monitoring is kind of too recent for that. So the thought was that those are instances where you might have kind of a TSP or a PM10 study that's going to be the only piece of evidence that we have. How to scale, we gave a suggestion on how to scale. This is an approach that we've seen use. Is that the best approach? I mean, I'd love to have that conversation with the panel and others who've done things like that to see if that's the best approach that can be used to make sure we're not double counting. So I don't want to give a strong answer on that yet. I'd like to open that up to the panel. And then on the PM 2.5 components, Jonathan and Rob, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think that as it's written is appropriate, that this is an emerging field of PM speciation, that there's a lot there as far as potential risks that are disproportionately depending on the chemistry of the particles. There's a lot there, but that to bind the EPA into going into this emerging field, which is not, there's not enough data to really go on, that we felt that, advise the EPA to follow this, but not necessarily try to build this into BenMAP. It's too premature. And it would be holding, it could backfire if we're requiring this type of level of detail.
I concur. I think it's appropriately worded now, and I'm sure EPA is thinking about this and appropriately should be planning for this in the future, because there aren't a lot of studies now, but there are great tools out there, and there are going to be a whole bunch of studies pretty quickly.
Well, that's great, and that seems consistent with other groups like WHO also keeping this in mind, but not quite quantifying it yet as ready for prime time, as it were. Mike Kleeman?
I guess just building on the idea of watching the emerging fields, and it strikes me with the TSP and the PM10 sort of being linked in this as well. The composition, but also the sources of the particles are very different in the TSP or PM10 size fraction versus the PM 2.5. And then you go to ultrafine and they're different again. And so I think that there are emerging techniques now, and more studies are using the source, emission source as well, the source origin of the particles as a factor to watch. And so that might merit also emerging fields to keep an eye on. It's certainly not ready for prime time yet, but it might merit the same sort of recommendation to EPA. So
many of these are really excellent points, and I think that that's something hopefully, Mike, you would be willing to go and add a sentence there down in the text where we talk about these things about health endpoints that might require, or this one's related to emerging effects about speciation and such, but speciation by source, that could be added. It sounds to me like we are largely in agreement that the recommendations, which are very nicely written, being very specific, that the preferred are appropriate and the minimum are too narrow. So it's very straightforward there, but that those are largely we're happy with that text as it is. Rob?
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing other people's opinion about scaling TSP and PM10, and in particular, even if we assume that all PM 2.5 is the same, that's the default assumption now, using a single coefficient to scale TSP or PM10 may vary depending on where you are. And so I guess one question I would have is whether the database is robust enough to be able to have one coefficient for scaling in all situations. So it may be the best we could do, but I'd be interested in what other people think, and whether it's accurate. Whether we even know enough to know whether there's going to be a lot of inaccuracy built into that.
Anyone looked into that? I mean, I would think that one could, at least from the model world, easily look at that ratio and see how consistent it is in space. But presumably there are many monitors that have both PM 2.5 and 10. I have a data set of those on my laptop somewhere, but haven't specifically looked at how constant that ratio is in time or space. I don't know. Is anybody else looked into this? Otherwise, maybe this is something we can follow up. Matt?
Yeah, I was going to say, and this isn't probably exactly answering Rob's question, but I know, I've done some analyses and seen some analyses where if you put in fine particulates and coarse particulates, so less than 2.5 and 2.5 through 10, all of the effect gets loaded on the 2.5.
Yeah.
Whereas if you did a PM10 analysis and you didn't include 2.5, you'd actually see that PM10 is kind of showing an effect, which to me is a way of saying PM10 is kind of a poorly measured version of PM 2.5, right? And you could say the same thing about TSP. And it doesn't precisely answer Rob's question of how much that might vary across the country, but that might be something that's worth reviewing, studies that have evaluated that coarse versus fine effects and see if they find a consistent pattern there. I don't know the answer to that offhand.
Yeah, I'm kind of remembering when I looked at this in ground monitors that there was a substantial variation in that ratio in places where you had both. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily large compared to the uncertainty in the exposure response function to begin with. And that's something that we might comment on too. So why don't we take one more question or comment on this, and then maybe it sounds like this is a robust discussion, but unlikely to affect the recommendations at the top. So we might be able to expand on the discussion within the underlying text here in the draft response. So Elizabeth Chan, please.
Hi, thanks, Dr. Chisel. This might not actually help the conversation, but I just wanted to note that analyses comparing coarse PM 10 to 2.5 to 2.5 are typically in the atmospheric sections of the ISAs. So the 2019 PM ISA should have that information, although a bit dated by this point.
Thank you. Okay. I think that does help for our follow-on to this. So it sounds to me like if there are no objections, we can essentially approve the recommendations at the top for 1B here, that everybody has said favorable things about those, and we can continue to expand a little bit on some of the issues like the sources. The differential sources is another emerging issue, and the difference between PM10 and TSP and PM 2.5, and add a little bit more information about the scaling there, including drawing from the ISA, which is could be a great resource for that. So no objections then. Why don't we move on to 1C. And at this stage, I would call, oh, good, you're not sitting in the dark there, Steve. So I guess you have power. Excellent. So I'll call on you, Steve Newbold, please.
We do have power back. Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
This charge question was about, there's 3 parts to it. EPA asked about conditions under which science or other best practices would support presenting multiple estimates of pollutant attributable mortality, whether the estimates in the TSD capture the range of potential benefits, and third part is scientific and analytic advantages and disadvantages of reporting benefits calculating using pooled estimates versus a single estimate best characterizing risk. So this, I actually would like to maybe ask Pete again to remind me how the current standard practice, as I understand it, before I characterize our response, is to report estimates using a single, report benefits using a single best estimate, and then characterize uncertainty by reporting benefits using alternative estimates from other studies. Did I understand that right, Pete, from TSD and what you said a moment ago?
Close. So we typically report 2 estimates. In particular, we typically use 2 estimates for mortality. For PM, this is 2 different studies. We don't take a position on one being preferable or primary. Generally, one is higher and one is lower. For ozone, one study describes short-term mortality and one study describes long-term mortality. So those are not strictly ordered as a high and low estimate. They're describing different things.
Okay. And the final, is there a bottom line benefit estimate that comes out of those, or are there sort of 2 bottom line benefit estimates?
There are 2, and different actors will report both, or the higher or the lower.
Okay, thank you for that reminder. Where we have landed so far at this point is summarized at the top in 2 recommendations, both tier 1. And these, I don't think I can take credit for these summarized recommendations or the tiering of them, but as are currently stated, the panel recommends the EPA present a single probabilistic estimate based on some form of pooling estimates with uncertainty ranges rather than multiple estimates for mortality outcomes. So we're recommending somehow synthesizing the multiple estimates that EPA currently uses, or presumably others, possibly others as well, to present, there would be a single central estimate, but also an uncertainty range around it. And to do this, our second part of this recommendation, we say this will require developing a systematic method for pooling available data that weights the studies to account for important differences among them, basically. Both of these are tier 1 recommendations. And sort of in the weeds of in the paragraphs that describe those recommendations, we say that presenting multiple estimates as part of the uncertainty range is one way to display uncertainty. And that, as far as we can tell, is consistent with guidelines. And we conclude that the mortality estimates described in the TSD do give an appropriate range of potential benefits. We also note that estimates from different studies can differ by a factor of 2 or more. So we go on to recommend pooling or combining these in some fashion. This section has not 1, but 2 appendices giving examples of ways that estimates could be pooled. These examples are not comprehensive and they don't amount to a complete systematic method for pooling estimates in all cases. So they in themselves don't meet the recommendations that we have indicated at the top of this charge questions, but they do illustrate what we think could be important parts of what's going to be challenging when pooling estimates in a lot of cases. So that's the spirit in which they are offered. And I don't know if this is the right time to discuss those appendices in any detail. I wasn't on for the very beginning, so this may be set aside for a later agenda item or not. But those
This is the right time, Steve.
Okay. So, and I'm happy to do that now. Those are included in the spirit of being very preliminary and open to discussion and scrutiny by the rest of this panel. I've gotten there's been a little bit of email traffic on these in the last few weeks, but not as much as they possibly deserve. So we can talk about these now. And I guess to tee them up a little more, Appendix A gives an example of how to pool beta coefficients from epi studies, different epi studies that looked at, in particular, subsets of the population, including different age ranges. And that example basically assumes that the different coefficient estimates differ because they are looking at different age ranges, which implies that different ages would have different coefficients. And that little example was set up to be easy to solve for different age range coefficients, given 3 beta coefficients from 3 different studies in the TSD. So that was an easy enough example to put together just to illustrate an approach for doing that. And Appendix B is distinct, and it is about credibility weighting and meta-analysis. So the idea there is one conventional form of meta-analysis basically takes estimates from different studies, estimates that are intending to represent the same underlying quantity, but no 2 studies get exactly the same result typically. So some of that variation is due to sampling error. Some of that variation is due to other forms of error or differences across studies, and conventional meta-analyses use different methods of weighting different estimates from different studies, at least partly in proportion to their precision, and also accounting for heterogeneity that can't be explained by sampling errors across the studies, to trying to get a single best point estimate and uncertainty range around that single best point estimate that uses information in all of the studies. This appendix adds one more wrinkle to this standard procedure and illustrates a way to account for the analyst's sort of ex ante assessments of quote unquote the quote unquote credibility of the identification strategy used in each study. Some different studies might use more or less credible methods to identify the effect that they're trying to estimate. If the analyst can form a judgment about the credibility of the studies ex ante, those judgments can be used to help create weights in a meta-analysis that would sort of basically replace the way this is currently done, as I understand it, is a bunch of studies are extracted from the literature and analysts make a ex ante judgment about whether the quality of the study on multiple dimensions is high enough to be included in the meta-analysis or not. So there's this 0, 1, include, exclude determination. This is trying to generalize that to allow for sort of partial inclusion, if you will. That's one way to think about what this is trying to do. So those are the two appendices that we've included in this section so far, like I said, both are provisional and open for discussion.
That's great. Can we have people's opinion on the both the appendices and the bold recommendations at the top, which again are two to pool and give a single value rather than multiple values, but that single value includes the uncertainty range based on the various studies and then the methodology for pooling, which is something, of course, that Pete just asked us to comment more on. So the floor is open. Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I'm supportive of both of the recommendations. Just one question is, there are papers out there that do meta-analysis. Was there a reason like we shouldn't refer to some of those as examples?
Well, I don't know, maybe Steve, you have an answer for that. My thought was that in general, those haven't been part of the EPA methodology because the meta-analysis typically includes papers outside of the US and Canada. And so therefore most of the meta-analysis were not applicable until they hopefully follow our recommendation to broaden the criteria. Steve?
But I mean, just to clarify what I was saying, even if the EPA doesn't just go to a particular meta-analysis and take their results, even if they have a different set of studies, and the methodology there is relevant, right? To Pete's question about how to do it.
Okay.
I think so, yeah. And there's one or two references, just very high level references to meta-analyses in this, to meta-analysis as a sort of general method in this section that we probably could include more. I'm kind of, in what I wrote of this section, I was kind of taking for granted, I guess, that EPA is aware of basic meta-analysis methods. The two sort of wrinkles that are addressed in the appendices are, I think, challenges or issues that may not be addressed in standard meta-analysis applications or methods applied to these kind of problems. So that's why they were included as possible additional component beyond what you might find in sort of textbook meta-analysis method.
Okay, well, that could be good to clarify in the text down here that there are meta-analyses, give some examples, and if they don't include, for instance, credibility weighting, point out that we're proposing something that's analogous to what they're doing, but perhaps not identical to what they're doing. That sounds very useful. How about Matt, please?
Yeah, I'm good. I like the recommendations, how they stand. I think the appendix on bringing in credibility weights is elegant. I like how it like, as you described, it kind of generalizes what's already done. The question I have on this, and I know we had a back and forth on this, Steve, is how to make this most useful to BenMAP, because the question is, how do you get these credibility weights? We know right now a lot of people, like you said, they just assign 0 and 1. They either include them if they're credible or they exclude them if they're not. So I just, for thinking about Pete, your perspective, and you want to implement this, like what's most useful from the panel? Do you want further clarification on how we can define these weights? And I'm not even sure that we have an answer for how to come up with these weights. But I want to at least put that out there.
I think what would be most helpful for us is we recognize that, right? There's evolving methods in how to do meta-analyses, right? As these appendices indicate. And so, and more generally in how to combine estimates across studies. And so I think what would be most helpful to us is discussing the various choices and the pros and cons. I think it's not certain, but it is likely that we would end up doing this ourselves as opposed to reviewing the literature, the existing meta-analyses, because of the various because of the choice of inputs.
That's very helpful too. Thank you. How about Nick Kumanov, please?
This is more of a question than a comment. In Appendix A, I thought that the last paragraph on page 69 was really helpful in thinking about how the age range weights would be decomposed. And it illustrates some complication that the latent risk coefficients that are estimated for the different age ranges turn out to be counterintuitive, that the highest risk coefficient is for the youngest group. And that got me thinking that those risk coefficients might be picking up other characteristics of studies, characteristics of the samples that are used and the methods and the time periods and so on. And if that's the case, if the risk coefficients that are loading on age are picking up other unobserved characteristics, does that compromise the consistency of the weighting procedure and the central estimate that comes out of it? And I wasn't able to think through the answer to that question, but Steve or others, do you have a sense of whether the weighting procedure is still valid?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's the biggest question. Like I said earlier, these examples are constructed to be as simple as possible. This appendix used some real numbers as inputs, the numbers that came from the TSD, and real data typically aren't as well behaved as you often hope. And this, simple procedure does assume this example does assume the only differences across studies are, the distribution of ages in the samples, and also assumes that each study basically sampled randomly from the general population. And so I infer that the distribution of ages within each study matched that. That's something that might be better measured by going to the original studies and seeing what they say about that, if anything. I have not done that. So the numbers could change if those assumptions are different, but that's not the only possible differences between studies that could affect these outcomes. This is similar to, or it reminds me of a question Mark asked over email, and you might want to say more about this, Mark, and that was about whether those baseline risks across studies need to appear in the weighting somehow. That the way I set it up, that equation has a baseline risk that sort of gets factored out from each study. And then it disappears from the rest of the computations. I think I've convinced myself that if the baseline risk can differ across studies, and that won't compromise the inferences about the different age-specific beta coefficients. But I'm not sure if that's true if those baseline risks themselves are not just different across studies, but also differ across age categories. I'd have to spend some more time working that out. So that's a question that's still open to my mind even. And there could be other things that differ across studies. And then I guess just inferring from that a little discussion, if those excluded factors, it's going to sound familiar, are correlated with the things you're able to account for in this attempt at decomposition, then you get biased, sort of inferred latent coefficients from it. So how to account for those other than doing your best to extract from the studies all the things that you think might cause differences across these sort of reduced form beta coefficients, and then proceed accordingly with a more complicated formula. That's my first response.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, those are complicated questions, especially when the answer is counterintuitive, like Nick just pointed out. Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder. First of all, big caveat. I mean, I've not followed the literature and the meta-analysis. So if what I'm about to say isn't true, then someone can correct me. But I mean, it seems to me that although in principle, the ideas of sort of thinking about the different age groups and thinking about weighting studies in a more nuanced way than just 0 and 1 is a good advance on the literature. However, in this context, I mean, I think my suspicion is what's most helpful to EPA is to give them something that's well vetted in the literature, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is we can tell them to weight the studies, but if no one on this panel knows how to weight the studies, then we've kind of set them up for a very difficult task. Similarly, you know, the discussion we just had with the ages, if we're recommending a fancier thing and then it gives counterintuitive results, then that's potentially problematic for the EPA. And that's a good thing to sort of just get vetted out through the literature until it kind of settles down and is probably more ready for prime time, so to speak. So that's the gist that I'm taking away from this conversation.
Thanks, Peter. I think that's quite helpful, and I think it also brings up your point about talking a little bit more about the meta-analyses that have been done in the literature, and if we end up writing something as kind of in response to Pete's suggestion about the pros and cons, the con is that it's a bit more subjective on how to do this credibility weighting, and that you might alias something like we think might be happening here with the ages, where the pro is that, of course, it is much more nuanced than 0 and 1, which we know is overly simplistic. How about Joe, please?
Great, thanks, Drew. And Steve, thanks for all your work on this. I think this is really quite good and quite fascinating. I want to make 2 comments on Appendix B, and I think they're kind of like things I would like in a new final paragraph, because I think what you have here is potentially more general. I recognize that it was a response to a charge question in number 2, but I think it's potentially more general along 2 dimensions. So first is when we think about it, the potential application, I think about this also to some of our economic studies that are trying to assess how people may value changes in morbidity or mortality risk. As a result, that brings in more than just a study where I might say something about causality. Right? So for example, I might think about credibility for a stated preference study, and I really care about meeting sort of best practices for the conduct of a contingent valuation study. And that's going to be different than, do I think I have a credible empirical strategy for causal inference, right? So I think that the dimensions on credibility here could be broader. And so if we're trying to think about this approach more generally as a way to conduct meta-analysis, I think it's quite appealing. But I think you would want to think about credibility being more than just how credible is causal inference, although I think that very much matters when we're thinking about this, applying it to sort of the understanding, you know, the kinds of questions that were posed that motivated the kinds of issues that motivated the question in charge question 2. The second thing I would say is when we think about this, even within, say, a conventional study where we want to say something about causal inference, we may also want to say something about other potential questions about the credibility of the results. And so one thing that's been quite common in recent years are concerns about publication bias and the error associated with that. And there have been some efforts in meta-analysis to do publication bias error corrections, including in, say, the value of statistical life literature. So I really like this. I like that you keep it really simple and as a way to help sort of motivate this. I think there's some ways we could sort of describe that. And it may be something when you say the agency could assign a credibility weight. I could also imagine we could suggest to the agency that they either do a call for papers or actually try to fund some research where you want some academics to do a kind of expert elicitation study. And that might be one way to sort of illustrate how one would go about doing this. Maybe through that expert elicitation study, we get a sense for a very well-defined part of the literature how this approach could be implemented, and then you get a kind of procedure that is then something that could be replicated by EPA going forward. So I really like this idea. I think there's a couple of things we could do to describe how EPA could move forward implementing this with a little bit more about how they might do, I think, an expert elicitation study for this, because that's what sort of comes to mind when I look at the second paragraph here. But I think there'd be value in highlighting how this could be applied more generally to how we understand our means by which we might combine studies as accounting for their credibility on a number of dimensions.
That's very helpful. Thank you,
Yeah.
Joe. I want to also echo what Joe just said, and thank you, Steve, that for all this work. I think this is really a very valuable section and one of the most interesting and worthwhile areas to discuss. I'm glad we've had a good discussion about it. My sense is that we have plenty to do to update the text of this discussion and comment more on the available methods and what's out there and what might be created, even potentially encouraged by EPA, as Joe was just pointing out, but that none of that at the moment affects the recommendations, which I've heard only support for. So it sounds like we would keep the recommendations themselves as they are and expand on the underlying text of how to achieve what we're recommending there. Given that, I realize much of this is overlapping with BenMAP, right? We're talking about what is BenMAP going to actually do, even though this is not the charge questions on BenMAP, and that's always kind of part of the complexity of this review panel with 5 questions that are general and then 5 related to BenMAP. So we are making some progress with BenMAP, but we've also passed the first hour of our 3-hour meeting and we're still on the first question. So given that, I think we might need to focus on going forward so that we have time for these kind of very fruitful discussions. So if there's no
one more thing
objections
too before we proceed?
Sorry, Steve.
Can I say one more thing before we proceed?
Sure,
Just
go
to,
ahead.
wrap up my impression of this for the moment is I guess I want to make sure I understand what we mean by the tiers, and I definitely sympathize with what a lot of folks have implied, and Peter, I think, has said explicitly that I think we want to be careful not to try to push the agency too far out over its skis, if that's the right metaphor in this case, and suggest that they need to completely overhaul what they're doing right now in favor of some aspirational approach that would address all of these meta-analysis and related challenges, though we haven't solved those problems for them. So I don't know if that reflects on what tier we should make these recommendations or not. But anyway, I just wanted to say I'm sensitive to that issue and concern, and I don't want to be too dogmatic about these recommendations when it's not yet warranted based on what's well understood in the literature.
Right. My understanding, Steve, and maybe that's not everybody's understanding, was that we would recommend that they use a single probabilistic estimate that is based on pooling beginning immediately, and that could, without specifying exactly how that's done. And then in the text, we would describe that there are, existing meta-analysis techniques which could be adopted right away. And then there's, over the longer term, the potential for doing this in more novel and potentially better ways going forward. But that, I think what you're bringing up is that there's just saying you should do it doesn't necessarily tell them what to do now. And I think maybe that's part of the motivation for Pete raising this question of, can you give us a little more explanation here on exactly how we would pool? And maybe there's a kind of first go at pooling and then a longer term development of better techniques and expert elicitation, things of that nature that really might us help do a better job going forward. Okay, great. I see a nice little emoticon of support. So we will return to 1C because that is an important one, and it's great to have a lot of discussion, but I think we should move on to 1D, for which I would turn to Jonathan Patz sorry, Jonathan, I happened to mention that right as you got up there, but if you would be willing to summarize 1D for us.
Yeah, no, I was just
Thanks.
closing the door.
Okay.
Yeah, so 1D is about the how frequent the EPA should update its studies that it uses in BenMAP. And basically, we looked at a lot of different intervals, but then Holly gave us a nice reminder that the EPA is tied to the Clean Air Act, and that is a 5-year scheduled review. So that made it a little simpler. And the most important thing, we felt that the EPA should not delay any further. So it should be 5 years and not longer than 5 years. But that in our recommendation, we thought that considering more shorter updates would be at its EPA's discretion when substantial advances in the science are reported. We came up with one other question that is more up to EPA, and that is, it would be nice to allow for users of BenMAP to be able to use their own beta coefficients if they feel so inclined and based on what they feel would be a really good study, but that so that would allow some flexibility in the use of BenMAP to use other concentration response functions, but that they wouldn't necessarily be officially endorsed by EPA. And I don't know if that is allowed, but that was what we came up with as a compromise. Is it's the 5-year interval, it's tied to the Clean Air Act. We endorse that, we support it, but can there be a way for users to use their own coefficients, but that it's not officially, endorsed by EPA? That was our compromise.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that worked well. I think this one is a little more straightforward, given that, as you pointed out, they're tethered to the Clean Air Act. I would note that in my chairs going over this, I took the recommendation, which I fully agreed with, was very useful, but the recommendation about BenMAP, and moved that from 1D to the second part of our review. So it is still there. If you don't see it in the document, I didn't delete your recommendation, but I did rearrange that when we were specifically asked to provide input on BenMAP, which seemed a more appropriate place, just so nobody thinks it's gone. I don't think, other than if anybody has comments on the prioritization of this, I wasn't really that sure what to put in there. I wrote tier 3, but it could, it's kind of I don't know, it's a bit arbitrary. If anybody has thoughts on the prioritization, welcome. Otherwise, I think this one is relatively straightforward.
I just had a question for Peter or Neil about this recommendation of that users can use their own functions, and this is not necessarily officially endorsed by EPA. Is that something that can work? Is that a problem or not in BenMAP?
I don't see any problem with that in principle. It's currently the case in BenMAP CE, the legacy desktop version, and it's on our list of features to add to the cloud version. That's just a resource allocation and development timeline thing.
Okay, thanks.
Terrific. And that's, it's mentioned in a general sense here, and then I believe repeated and more specifically as regards BenMAP later. Great. I'm not seeing any comments at the moment. So in the interest of time, it sounds like we're in good shape. Thank you, Jonathan, and those who worked on 1D. And I would propose we go on to question 2. And with 2A, I mean, to me, it seems like that one was very, very straightforward, Christy. So unless you have anything to point out, okay. It sounds like, I mean, we essentially wrote a line. Yeah. Okay, good. So we will come back to you, Christy, when we get to question 3. But I think we're all good on 2A, which was, are the rates matched to the outcomes? And the answer is essentially yes. So we could go to 2B, which is the rates resolved to the appropriate spatial and temporal scale. And for that one, I turn to Jonathan Bonacore, please.
Hi, so for this one, I was just asking whether the rates resolved to appropriate both spatial and temporal scale for performing the benefits analysis. Our kind of top line tier 2 is that recommending that all baseline rates of death and disease are resolved at county level, as some already are, or as close as possible to that level. An EPA balance has a little bit of a balancing act with using the most up-to-date rates available, balancing that with stability of longer term data collected over longer time scales. As far as going to the details of that, there's this issue of spatial scales, where right now EPA has some information on mortality stratified by age, cause, race, county, which is fairly adequate. There's for other health outcomes, the level of detail provided we judge to be potentially inadequate, but difficult to really judge the adequacy of it because of how the spatial resolution of the data is described. Basically what's going on in there is that within the TSD, they talk about the kind of underlying geographical data, or the geographic resolution of the data, by saying it's national, state, county, or national, state, or county. And there's no information provided about how many states have county level, how many states are using state level, how many are county. So like for most of the outcomes, it's equally likely, and there's no information as to whether like are 41 states using county level data, or is like one state using county level data. And without that information, it's hard to judge how well represented the geographical resolution of the data of the underlying health data is. There's some health outcomes of particular interest that have national averages, including asthma, Parkinson's, allergic rhinitis, cardiac arrest, lung cancer, and a few others. This means it's going to miss hotspots of background disease. So kind of in the end, the TSD, it has says we could benefit by looking at the data quality and doing a better job of kind of assessing the data quality. Again, being more clear about what the actual data, the geographic resolution of the data underlying the analysis is. We do also suggest EPA uses some alternative methodologies and data sets. This includes looking at like state or city departments of public health, using data available from Medicare or Medicaid, or using these different imputation, downscaling, or interpolation methods, which have been used in other applications before. So that's all spatial scale. For time scale, we do kind of admit that there's this balancing act, because longer term averages are more stable and robust, but this is challenging with COVID, which not only did it have its effect of increasing background mortality rate sort of by nature of being a pandemic, it potentially has changed background vulnerability just throughout the US. So there will be, we admit there's going to be a challenge there as far as picking kind of the right temporal resolution going forward for the next few years. And we do also state that would it be appropriate for EPA to incorporate differences of background disease rates in a formal uncertainty analysis, including spatial variability, general uncertainty, and uncertainty introduced by having data at low resolution. That is the end of that.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let's, are there questions, comments that people have, issues that you wanted to discuss related to 2B? Anybody? Okay, it looks like we're in reasonably good shape on that. We might, I saw there was at least a comment about perhaps even finer than county level would be useful for distributional analyses in some cases. So we can consider adding some language on that. Why don't, if there's no discussion items, why don't we try to again, there's always this tension because it's hard to remember a 75-page document. So it's great to get a summary of what's in there, but perhaps in the interest of time, let's see if we really.
2C was Chris Tessum.
Yeah, if we can try to focus on any question issues that are up for discussion for these. So yes, Chris, can we go on to 2C, please?
Yeah, so we just basically say that the current data are okay, but we recommend moving towards using the shared economic pathways or some sort of other way to incorporate scenario uncertainty. And so there's a question from Pete about kind of downscaling that, and I don't know if we want to maybe have like a separate discussion about that later or something, or now, or
well, I mean, we only got the question an hour ago, so I'm not sure people have had time to really think about how the SSPs are downscaled to finer resolution. So if anybody has anything to point out about that, but otherwise that's fine. Otherwise, I would suggest maybe we give that a little bit of thought and then see if there's something we could add specifically in response to Pete's question about how we might use downscaled results based on the SSPs. Okay, I'm not seeing any comments at the moment on 2C. So thank you, Chris. I think we are in good shape there with the caveat that we will return to address Pete's comments. If we go to 2D, and again, let's see if there are any specific issues that require additional discussion here. Back to you, Jonathan, again.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'll try to be a little quicker here. Basically just asking about race and ethnicity stratified mortality incidents. We concluded the current approach is appropriate, but longer term, EPA should look for sub-county information and additional data sets, especially related to COVID. Again, here it'd be appropriate to look at Medicare, Medicaid, and other kind of public health authority data sets, including imputation methods here. There was a question in the TSD, specifically the race stratification used 2007 to 2016 as the dates, but 2012 to 2014 was the baseline. It's just unclear why different date ranges were used there. Just again, requesting at minimum an acknowledgement of the effect of COVID on long-term mortality rates.
Great. That's very helpful. And maybe this partially addresses the comment that I mentioned on 2B about finer level data for distributional, because that does come up here. Mike, please.
I guess I just want to amplify the California experience. I mean, some of the counties in and around Los Angeles are quite large, quite heterogeneous, and one county doesn't really capture any of that complexity. And so I guess I just want to emphasize and amplify that comment about the need for sub-county analysis in some places, especially California.
a good point. Very, very well taken. I see, Matt, please.
And one thought I have, I'm thinking about using publicly available data, and maybe this has to do with the previous charge question as well. Is I know, and maybe you mean this is just making general recommendations of, hey, there's Medicare data, there's Medicaid data. I always get worried thinking about using Medicaid data to try to get anything representative because it's a very unrepresentative population. I mean, Medicare we know is representative of people over 65, but Medicaid is most definitely not representative, and then it varies a lot by state as well. So I would just want to add caveats around Medicaid data, not to mention it's often really hard to get access to Medicaid data because it's run by states, especially if you want sub-county data or possibly even county data. So it's just a comment.
No, it's a very useful comment. You're right. Medicaid is just hugely variable across states. Okay, so we have a couple excellent points about large counties, state level Medicaid, et cetera. I think those are relatively straightforward to add into the draft text, and I don't see that we have any objection currently or suggestions to change the recommendations. So I think we're in good shape there, barring any last minute comments. So why don't we move on to 2E, which would be to Rob McConnell, please.
Thanks, Drew. So this question concerns projecting baseline morbidity into the future, and I wasn't familiar with this literature on shared socioeconomic pathways, so maybe somebody else could comment if there are questions. But this seems like a reasonable framework, and it's described in a fair amount of detail with some references in 2C, I think. And then, I think there's some real challenges to this, and I gave some examples. But I think with some caveats, this is a reasonable way to proceed. The point was made that there's been a lot of literature on differences in baseline rates by race and ethnicity. I think that's an important point, and at least that should be thought about. And of course, we can make some pretty reliable projections about changes in age, and that's going to be the biggest determinant of what baseline morbidity is. And so I think I think it's a nice section. It's had several people involved in it, and unless there are any questions, we could probably go on.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, there's been lots of nice work using the SSPs, and we're not, which shows, just like you said, age is one of the most biggest, probably the biggest.
We wrote a paper a few years ago where it shouldn't have been surprising, but pretty much no matter what you do to reduce air pollution in Los Angeles County, you get increased burden of disease because we're all getting older.
Right. But at least, people are living longer, so we can think of the positive on that. And we're not overly prescriptive, right? SSPs are not mandated by the panel as the best thing. It's just an example. So great. It seems like we are all on the same page here. If there are any other additional comments, please raise a hand or just chime in. Nick, please.
I don't have experience using the shared socioeconomic pathways, but my casual understanding is that the projections for population growth are also tied to projections for income growth and education. And those in turn will affect VSL through the income elasticity. And so if we're going to recommend using shared socioeconomic pathways, we might want to have a comment here that connects it to projections for future VSL.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Yes, they are definitely tied to, things like education levels of women and girls are tied to population, and which is all tied to income, et cetera. Great point. Thank you. Enid?
Yeah, the comment I wanted to make is kind of whether like subpopulations, especially immigrant populations that tend to scale down when it comes to age, whether that would have kind of a difference in these projections such that you can kind of look at the age effect that Rob described so well as being very much partitioned into certain subgroups in our population.
Yeah, that's a good question. My understanding is that it was not done in the original SSPs, but when groups have done follow-on work to provide more detailed analysis of interpreting them, they may have covered that. I don't know. That should be something we could look into. And that might get to also the point Pete raised about combining work by different groups when they've looked at the SSPs and their implications, but done that individually. So let's note that to follow up.
Could I forget who it was who made the original comment about, you know, some I don't know if it's a limitation about the SSPs. I don't know if that was, can't remember whether it was Nick, or could you provide a sentence or two making that point?
Yeah, I can certainly write a couple of sentences talking about the need to connect it to VSL through changes in projected income and earnings, and Lisa may have more to say about this.
Okay, yeah, let's hear from Lisa, and then we'll see.
I had 2 points, one general one, and one specific to the issue that Nick raises. I really don't know where this fits in, but I think that there's a cross-cutting issue here that goes across all the questions we've been discussing, which has to do with the increased emphasis on need for distributional analysis, which means we need more and better information on different measures of advantage and disadvantage. And this needs to be more than just above and below the poverty line. We need measures of disadvantage that don't have to do with income, but we also need to know the whole income gradient from rich to poor. Just having a threshold doesn't help us very much. I mean, it helps us somewhat. But so I'm wondering whether somewhere, and I don't know where in the report this belongs, we should just make a statement that says we understand that understanding the distribution of both costs and benefits is increasingly important for EPA as a result of different executive orders and so on and so forth, and encourage the agency on all these different metrics to provide information on measures of advantage and disadvantage that aren't thresholds, that are you know, for income, everything from the lowest income to the highest income. Same thing for education and other things. So that's my first comment. It's very hard to do the sort of analyses that President Biden and others are asking us to do if we don't have that data. The second thing is on Nick's comment, I think it was, and I'm not sure how to handle this. We have, so you know, I've written a lot of guidance on doing different types of analyses, and we've always, it's pretty clear that conceptually you would want to adjust the VSL for the income level of the people that are affected, because you want to reflect people's willingness to pay for their own change in risk. EPA and others have been very reluctant to do this because it runs into problems with people's perception of being unfair because of all the confusion about what the VSL concept means. I actually sort of liked the phrasing that came later in the report about, I can't remember now the words, I'd have to flip back to the right page, but it basically says, we understand that you could do this adjustment, but I think we want to, or at least I would want to, leave it up to the discretion of the agency to think about these VSL adjustments by income groups, because it's just gone, there's so much misunderstanding of what these concept means that it just, what ends up happening is the agency gets beat up around all these issues that have to do with understanding the VSL concept, instead of being able to focus on, you know, what is more important to their central mission, which is improving air quality across all these different populations.
Yeah, that's if we're not including that kind of thing, then we have the SSPs include things like income inequality within countries, but that doesn't go into the VSL, so it's somehow a separate thing. And it's not, as you noted, Lisa, I'm not sure exactly where that goes either, because it's not restricted to this 2E, which is about morbidity rates, right? It applies much more broadly. So it sounds to me like maybe we are okay with 2E as it is, but we do have an issue which is perhaps not one of the recommendations, but needs to go into somewhere where we introduce the idea of using something like the SSPs, that they were not designed to look at distributional impacts, but they do contain valuable information, and there is room for further exploration of how that can be brought in, since it's not going to go into something like the VSL, but could definitely, fit with the overall push by the administration to take into account such things.
Just to clarify, well, so I think we could write something somewhere at the very beginning of the report that it's very similar to what we did on charge question 4, that just sort of says, here's a cross-cutting issue, and we'll talk about. On the VSL, I like the language. I don't think we should leave it alone. I think it's more that we should say, we recognize that having this data allows EPA to make these other adjustments in both the values for morbidity and mortality. So that's, so it's noting the issue, but recognizing that's a policy decision for the agency. It's not really a scientific decision.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe at the start of 2, the same way as we have a kind of introductory paragraph to some cross-cutting issues, we could point this out, since it applies to multiple subparts. Okay, good. So we are slightly past the halfway point. It's 11:40 by my clock. I would suggest we take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 11:45, so everybody can have a chance to go away from their screen for a moment, use the restroom, get a coffee, water, whatever you like. And then we will return, and we will try to hopefully make slightly faster progress, just in the interest of time, although the discussions are great, on 3, 4, 5, etc. So see you all at 11:45, 5 minutes. Hello, everybody. Hopefully people are back. I have just 11:45 and our clock's wound down. But I have a refill of my coffee. So from my point of view, it was a break well spent. Good. I'm not sure how many are back. I hope most people are back. I see a couple of cameras coming back on. Good. It looks like we have a number of people. I wonder if, given that we are, at least in order, by number of charge questions, we're 20% through at far more than maybe about 60% through our time, 20% through our charge questions. I wonder if we should think of a slightly different format for the remainder of our time, and if it might be more constructive to, instead of going sequentially through every sub question here, if we kind of go through the questions 3 through 10 when there is a need to discuss a particular question. That is, if the panel would like to stop and discuss any particular one, we do so, and otherwise we kind of move ahead. So maybe everybody can ponder that for a minute. I also wanted to, before we even get to returning to get through the questions, just to get a sense, I remembered the word that is usually used in government circles, that, or at least international government circles I've been involved in, is a non-objection period. That's when they want to get something done and they just put something out and say, we will leave this for a non-objection approval process. And so if nobody speaks up, it goes through. I would think that based on my reading of all of our responses, that going back to this idea of an overall view on the EPA's methodology, that the panel's conclusion is that we are generally supportive, despite providing multiple recommendations for improvement, but we think that the EPA should continue, and we laud even their efforts, right? That it is a BenMAP is a wonderful tool, useful for science and regulation, that can be made even better. And the benefits methodology used for regulations is similarly a very valuable approach, which can be made even better. So if there are no objections to that, then I think Holly and I could craft an introductory paragraph on that could be part of our review. But I wanted to give people a chance to object to that or recommend something different, just to make sure we're all on board for that, and then we can go ahead and put that language together. Okay, so speak up at any point in the next hour if you don't agree. Otherwise, we'll assume that that is also approved as a general opinion, and you'll of course be able to comment on the language that we put together. Mike?
I just wanted to, I guess, advocate also the inclusion of all the functionality that was in the previous version of BenMAP and the new version of BenMAP. And I don't know whether that rises to the level of being mentioned in that summary paragraph or not, but I feel strongly about it that, you know, I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiment that BenMAP is a very useful tool, but I want to see all of the functionality that was in previous versions sort of maintained going forward. And so I hope that we could make that recommendation.
Thanks, Mike. And I think you were not the only one to express that kind of sentiment. So I think that the panel at large agrees with you. I think we can, Holly and I can endeavor to get that on board somewhere prominently. Good. So I think we are good there. Then what I would propose is just to remind everybody, we have two things that I would like to get done in this last hour and 10 minutes. One is going through details of specific issues that need discussion in the remainder of the questions. The other is trying to get a sense of which recommendations should be prioritized in the letter to the administrator, which again is limited to 3 pages, so cannot fit even all of the current bulleted recommendations, let alone that we might add more for BenMAP section if we so choose. So why don't we, what I would suggest then is maybe when we hit a half an hour left in the meeting, we switch to trying to assemble a list of what are the most important recommendations so that we at least have some time left for that issue, because I think that is really quite important, since those, if you think about most documents, the executive summary is the kind of thing, or the summary for decision makers or whatever it's called. That's the thing that often gets the bulk of the attention from the high ups. So I think we do need to devote some time to that. Okay, so that gives us even shorter, but only 40 minutes or so to get through the remainder of the questions. That said, there are likely to be areas that need some discussion. So why don't I open it up to I'll just go through the leads for question 3, and for 3A, that was Chris Tessum. Is there anything that you want to bring up for 3A, or should we go to?
No, I don't think so. I'm just trying to remember which one that was.
Sorry. Does the demographic information used to quantify pollutant attributable cases reflect the best available science?
Yeah, I don't think we have anything specific to talk about that.
Okay, great. I think anybody else on the panel have anything that they want to raise for 3A? We have a couple recommendations there that they, again, shift to scenarios such as the SSPs rather than the single deterministic projection. Okay. How about then 3B would be Jonathan, and those people, who is it? Let's see. Let me just interrupt myself for a second there. Chris, you're Chris again for 3C, Christy for 3D, and Enid for 3E, if you want to look ahead a tiny bit and see if there's anything on 3. Actually, maybe we could just do all 5 in a row. Maybe that's more efficient if everybody who's in charge. So that would be Jonathan Bonacor, if you want to look at 3B, Chris Tessum 3C, Christy Pullen Fednick 3D, and Enid Neptune 3E. And then if anybody has issues to raise, we can turn to those specific charge question sub points, whatever they're called.
So I guess for 3B, it's about the projected population projections, and we just say here to use the shared socioeconomic pathways. We'll probably have to add a little bit of detail to Pete's question about geographic resolution, but I think otherwise nothing to add.
Okay, great. Right. Yeah, Pete did raise that question of the resolution, the spatial resolution there. Perfect. Okay. And C, D, or E from Chris, Christy, or Enid? Anything?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just like we recommend more data, stratified by demographic groups, and kind of moving away from the woods and pool data towards the scenarios, which it's kind of
okay
throughout the.
Good. So we seem to be in pretty good shape on some of these. There are certain of the sub questions are, of course, led to much more discussion and a little more contentious. Try to figure out what the right answer was. For 3D was the number of individuals according to poverty status, educational attainment, linguistic isolation, et cetera. And it was a question about the data. Christy, were we?
Yeah, for 3D, I mean, this was again, just getting more details on what specific indicators the agency was using. So, you can actually just use the variable if they're going back to the American Community Survey data, for example, and really, encouraging the agency to look at the social vulnerability index and, the variables that they use in order to pull together some of these groupings, for socioeconomic status, et cetera. So it doesn't seem like there's anything controversial, but happy to talk more about that.
Okay, great. I mean, if there's any points that anybody on the panel would like to raise about any of these 5 subparts for C, that's fine. And in fact, I see a hand now. Matthew, please.
Yeah, I asked a question on I think it was 3C. So talking about not just male and female, but adding sexual minorities as well. I guess the question I have in exploring that is, what do you do when you have, in some instances, we might have estimates that the effects of pollution are different for people who don't identify as male or female, but what about cases where we don't? So if we've created this third group and or multiple groups beyond those main two, how would we think about advising EPA if we don't have separate estimates for that group, but we might have estimates for male versus female? I just would want to point that out as something to think about there.
It's an intriguing question. Yeah, I have never seen exposure response functions for people who don't identify as male or female. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. I haven't, so I'm not too current on the literature with that, but I would imagine there kind of would be a number of methodological issues. So it might be kind of the thing that we would recommend exploring, doing that rather than, because it, like that, I imagine that might kind of track with a lot of other variables also that would then may make it difficult to actually get a good signal out of any analysis that you do. But I think if we kind of say like, we recommend exploring, the inclusion of these categories, that might be the right level of.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. And the current language is something along those lines, with we recognize that these efforts may be hindered by data limitations, et cetera. That's something worth revisiting. Thank you, Matt, for raising that. Anything else on Christy?
Yeah, I was also going to say on 3D, and I wondered from, for the overall recommendations. So within BenMAP, the definition of poverty is relatively narrow, and within the text we talk about expanding that, doing some sensitivity analysis to really understand whether or not they're capturing poverty, including additional variables like income or educational attainment or other things. And that was classified as tier 3. In some ways, to me, that feels more important, since this is something that is really critical for the analysis, particularly for a regulatory application. And so I wondered if I don't know if we need a discussion about it, but ultimately, I don't know that that's actually tier 3. I would move it up in tiers, potentially even to tier 1, given how critical this is for defining population.
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, and I think that was, partially this was my mental confusion a little bit about how one should prioritize things that were important but quite challenging given current data. And so I was thinking that, oh well, if it's not so, if we might not be able to do it right away, it should be given a lower tier. After I had some discussion with Holly afterwards, and she said that we can give a more nuanced response and say that this is, in terms of priority or importance, it's higher priority, but we recognize that it might take a while, and that we don't have to bump something down simply because the data might not be ready. So I think that.
And this is actually a relatively easy lift, though. I mean, the data sets exist. And so it's just a matter of incorporating them in. So the SVI is at the Social Vulnerability Index from the CDC, at least, and that's also relying on ACS data. They have a really good data dictionary on how they define socioeconomic status, et cetera. It's at the county level, tract level. So it's not, the wheel doesn't have to be reinvented for this. So I would, again, I think in terms of priority, it could be something that's relatively a light lift to be able to do.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. So I would be quite pleased then if all that the data is available to move that up. Yeah, great suggestion. Any other comments on any parts of question 3?
I guess there's one other thing, which is that in addition to the CDC index, there's the new, I think it's from the White House one, CJEST or something like that.
Yeah.
So the EPA actually has its own tool for something similar now. So I don't know if we want to mention that too, but then also they're asking about the data used on that question rather than the metrics used, right? So I don't know if we're getting a little bit outside of what they're asking for by recommending changing the metrics they're using.
Well, we might be, but I think that's okay. They don't have to. It's just a recommendation, right? It's not that we're setting rules for them, and I think that could be still a valuable thing to point out. So that would go in D. Do you think, Chris, or is
Yeah,
that?
the TJ. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a similar type of thing as the CDC social vulnerability one. Christy, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, CGEST, again, they're all utilizing ACS data for the most part. So if the agency is already utilizing ACS data and the SVI, EJ screen, there are lots of these tools out there that they could utilize. And again, the question is about whether or not the data or the data used are appropriate. And I would say, again, if you have sister agencies or even if within the agency itself that are utilizing, just more nuanced ways of looking at these outcomes or these indicators, I would suggest doing some of that again, which is a relatively easy lift. Just looking at the CDC SVI gives you everything you need it gives you the variable names, all of that, their calculations that they utilize to be able to do some of this as well too. And so some sensitivity analysis again shouldn't be too heavy of a lift too.
Okay, great. And Christy, since you're familiar with those, maybe you can consider if it's worth referring to EJ Screen or any of the others in the text.
Yep.
But it sounds like we're in pretty good shape. Super. Okay, and 3E is quite a short one there, where we
Yeah, I can just weigh in that I'm basically given kind of just my wish list of some of the other factors that kind of impact on health outcomes that are imperfectly captured. It may be somewhat aspirational because, to be honest, I'm not sure how easy some of these data would be to capture. I don't think they're incredibly onerous, actually, in terms of premature birth, proximity to healthcare structures, healthcare providers, and migration patterns. And I think that the link to exposures as well as to health outcomes are so intimate, and that I think those definitely should be captured and they should be prioritized. So I too don't like the fact that these are tier 3 or deemed tier 3, because I think those are really important.
Okay, and again, if these data are not extremely difficult to obtain and are actually available and such, then I, for one, am quite content to increase the prioritization for these. Same as for the other one that we just talked about, D, I think it was. Great. Okay, so are there any other questions any other comments from the panel on 3? I think we've got some good suggestions here to change the prioritization, if not the recommendations themselves, and to add a few things into some of the subparts. Otherwise, I would say we are ready to move on to 4. Okay, seeing no hands or comments. 4 is unfortunately one with a very large number of parts. So why don't we, I'm not sure it'll be quite as easy to deal with them the quick way we polished off 3 there. But let's start here. So 4, actually, to remind everybody, 4 is one where Lisa led the writing of this cross-cutting discussion at the beginning. And so maybe we can begin with that and or a discussion of known issues that people would like to bring up before the panel. So I see Lisa has her hand up. Why don't we just start with you, Lisa?
Well, I have a suggestion on process and also a comment on this overall recommendation. Most of the subparts of question 4 have to do with sort of the details of what we deal with in the cross-cutting discussions. So if we can quickly talk about the cross-cutting discussion, maybe we can just go through the remaining questions quickly to add and subtract. I also, Drew and I had a little bit of a conversation about this a little late in the game, I think, after this report had gotten posted. But I've done a lot of these sorts of reviews that we're recommending, the cost of illness literature, the wellness pay literature, and the quality literature over the past, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. And it's entirely possible, it's always a time and resource issue, but it's entirely possible to just do it all in one fell swoop, to do a review that looks at more comprehensive measures of cost of illness, that reviews the willingness to pay literature and reviews the HRQL literature or the quality literature. So I'm not sure how this fits into your tiers, Drew, but I'm not sure it's really necessary to break them out into separate tiers. I think that EPA is going to have to exercise some discretion in terms of its budgetary resources. But we could just have a single recommendation that says, you should do all three of these things. Look more comprehensively at cost of illness estimates. Do a criteria-driven review of the willingness to pay literature that builds on numerous reviews that have been done. We cite some in the in responding to that question, but there's also some that are not public yet that would be useful. And to the extent that the willingness to pay literature is weak, also look at the quality literature, and then we can just pull out the additional things in the individual responses. The one thing that is really different is the income elasticity question. So I think that definitely deserves some separate attention.
Sorry, the one thing that's really different is which one, Lisa?
I'm sorry, am I too far away from my speaker?
No, I just missed that one bit.
Oh, the one thing that is really different that doesn't sort of fit into what I just said is the final one on income elasticity, because that's really
it. Elasticity. Yes, right. Okay. Well, I, for one, am a great believer in the parsimony, and if we can combine those three into a single recommendation and just say this is what they should do, that sounds like a great suggestion to me.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we follow then what Lisa said and have comments, see how it goes on the overall cross-cutting, which does indeed reflect much of what's in A through I, at least. Anyone want to chime in with opinions or comments or suggestions related to, or questions related to the cross-cutting discussion evaluation approaches?
I should say that the income the lag questions also are a little bit separate from what I say in the cross-cutting discussion. I'm sorry, I forgot that.
Lisa, could you just repeat the way you suggested rephrasing that bold-faced recommendation?
So it might be easier for me to just write it down, but I think, EPA could commission, from one of its contractors, the way it usually does, a report that reviews the cost of illness literature, looking for more comprehensive estimates, reviews the willingness to pay literature using a criteria-driven review that builds on previous reviews, and reviews the quality literature for each of its health endpoints. But if you want, Holly, I can just write this up later and give you some.
Oh, it's okay. I've got it for now. Thank you.
Okay.
So that would, in some sense, combine what's currently numbered 1, 3, and 4 into, a single recommendation, which sounds good. Okay, why don't we have some other hands? So why don't we begin with Matthew, please?
Yeah, I know Lisa and I had long email exchange about various methods here, and I think that we're not. I mean, it's something we can't resolve in the time frame we're in, but I wonder if we need to have just a bigger conversation, because there are different approaches here and for taking, and I think we should just think it might be useful in the spirit of kind of Pete's earlier comments, like think of pros and cons of different methods for coming up with more robust measures of willingness to pay. Because I think there are a couple more that we could think of that may not have some desirable properties, but may have other things that are appealing to them.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't make problems with that, Matt. I try to be fast.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I hear you.
Matt, would those affect the recommendations, do you think, or that's more of a nuanced discussion of the pros and cons of different approaches, but would leave the recommendations?
We could just include in there, I don't know how to phrase this rigorously, but think creatively or look at some of the newer literature or something like that, because there's some discussion in here of structural models. Matt and I've been talking about different ways of using the health-related quality of life estimates that go into quality. So they all definitely get into the technical details, but I think we could come up with some broad sentence for this top recommendation that captures that.
Yeah, I think it might be some of the boldest stuff needs to be adjusted just a little bit, the top line recommendations, and then there's more in the details that we need to discuss.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful to understand that will affect both.
The process question, Drew, actually for you and Holly. I think that on some of the things that we've been emailing about, it might be worth having sort of another little subgroup meeting. I'm assuming that's allowed, right? That I don't. There's been some back and forth between me, Matt, Steve, and a few other people about some of these issues, and I don't want to take up time now. It seems like if we could just set up a meeting to talk some more about this later, that'd be good.
No, I think it's better to do it now. I realize we're pressed for time, but
this is not something. This would take us easily a half an hour.
Oh.
It's not simple because we've got to get into the technical weeds.
Okay. Well, as long as it's discussed on the June 15th call, the outcome of the subgroup.
Yeah, for sure.
Discussion.
For sure.
Okay, so we'll have a subgroup to follow up on some of that between this call and the next one. And for the moment, then let's turn to Rob, please, and then Mike.
Yeah, so I was involved. I thought a lot about 4A and 4C. I think they're related, and one of the insights that I hadn't appreciated before is that the latency or the lag to onset of disease is probably different from the pattern of decline in disease after you reduce exposure. And I think that thought is well captured in 4C. It's a tier 3 recommendation. I think it's probably relevant to the 4A, whether you assume there's a 5-year or a 20-year segmented lag. And I think EPA singled out lung cancer because that has a very long latency, and they thought about different ways of doing it. And I think that sort of tier 3 recommendation for 4C that says examine whether a response to increases of air pollution exposure is equal but opposite to the response to equivalent exposure decreases for lung cancer. I think that the takeaway message from that is that they may be different, and they may be cause specific. There's a lot of discussion about why lung cancer might be different. That's an obvious one, but that may be true for other diseases as well. Then that's a huge lift, but I think it's something that EPA ought to be thinking about. It's specifically in the case of lung cancer, but maybe more broadly. So that might go as a tier 3 recommendation someplace more prominent than just lung cancer. I don't feel strongly about it, but just as a consideration for the committee.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Yeah, we could broaden that discussion of kind of hysteresis and exposure response to other impacts. Mike, please, and then Chris.
I just have a quick question for the group. I recognize that it's definitely worthwhile to try to update our evaluation methods and bring the latest science into this process. But this is one of the bottom line things that really is the eye-catching sort of bottom line from the BenMAP analysis. Would the committee recommend that we keep the traditional, if you want to call that, valuation approaches as an option, and then also have the option to adopt the newer methods, or do you want to just jump right to the newer methods? because it is sort of the heartbeat of BenMAP, really, to, you know, it's a very sort of core thing that we're talking about here. So I'm just curious what the committee is recommending here.
Anyone involved in 4 want to chime in there in response to Mike's question?
I'm happy to. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to block the some things that are going on in the background here. EPA's approach is so out of date that I think it's most of the other agencies have updated since. I mean, a lot of what EPA, not for all the endpoints, but for many of them, it's just so old that I think it's essential that at least for evaluation, they update things. I can't, the lag stuff I can't speak to, but I think it's time.
Well, and perhaps if it's at least extremely transparent, one could go back and forth. If one really wanted to say, if I had used the older method, maybe you could convert from, you know, the more modern VSL.
Well, we're never going to lose, right, information on how EPA used to do things. So we can always make the comparison. Just to be clear, though, Drew, we're talking about non-fatal endpoints here. The VSL,
right.
Not VSL, but VSC, value per statistical cases, what sometimes people say. But you know, so people are always able to do the comparison, but I think that's very different than saying we should be continuing to use data that, you know, was developed in the early 1990s. I don't think that's a good idea.
Okay, Chris, please.
Yeah, so just for me in the cross-cutting part, it seems like we're recommending varying willingness to pay numbers and probably the VSL too, based on income and age. And so I just wanted to flag that while that may be the technically correct way to do it, there's kind of an interplay in between like how things should be used and how they do get used, and it would represent a departure from the way that the EPA currently does it. So I don't know if we want to discuss that.
You know, Chris, I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking when I was reading this that it's sort of the way it's written right now, it's a little bit of inside baseball. I think we might need to be a little bit more explicit about what not only EPA, but the other federal agencies do now. The income adjustment is for income growth over time. So it's population average income changing over time. EPA does not discriminate between different income levels at a given point in time. So they don't use different values for rich or poor people. Other agencies don't either. So I think, in terms of age, for cost of illness estimates, I think that's not controversial. In the quality literature, health economists are quite comfortable with using different values for people of different ages. Where it becomes an issue is in the willingness to pay literature. For non-fatal health effects, we don't have very good data on differences in willingness to pay by age. We've done some reviews, and I won't bore you with all the details, but I think the willingness to pay literature is just kind of thin. For VSL, we have better data, but VSL is somewhat off of our plate. So my understanding from Holly and Drew is that we can reinforce the idea that it's time for EPA to update their VSL estimates.
Yes, I keep getting confused about the elasticity over time of the VSL, but not the VSL itself, and you know which thing we're actually. Yes, but we can comment on that. Okay, are there others from the panel who would like to comment on 4? Why don't we also open it up to, and we've been talking about the general overview here at the top, and it sounds like we've got some work to do in revising, well, hopefully both simplifying the recommendations as per Lisa's suggestion, and also broadening the language a little bit to respond to the comments Matt raised. beyond that, are there comments about either this cross-cutting discussion, or we can open it up to all of the subparts? We heard a little bit from Rob about a nice comment on this hysteresis effect and 4C. Any other things for A, B, D, E?
We do need to talk separately about the income elasticity one.
Well, why don't we go ahead and unless there are other comments about any of the other issues in question 4, if we have one that we know about that we want to talk about, this income elasticity issue, why don't we just dive into that before we run out of time? Lisa, do you want to introduce the issue?
Well, I'm not sure that Joe and I are entirely on the same page on this, so I'm not sure whether he wants to lead or I want to lead. I think in my mind, there's 2 issues here, and one is it's kind of silly. Well, EPA's approach for adjusting for changes in income is clearly outdated. Its VSL estimates are also clearly outdated. So that raises the question of whether the 2 should be part of the same effort, or whether it's okay to go ahead and adjust just for income. If they do adjust just for income the way that we are currently suggesting, they're going to end up with estimates that are well outside of the range of what anybody, at least certainly I do a lot of reviews of this literature, I think is reasonable. So I think this is I think some of you saw there's a report that Jim and I did for that the EAC review, the SAB Environmental Economics Group reviewed 2017, I think. And what we had written was originally intended to focus on updating what's in BenMAP. EPA then took it and applied it to its overall approach for VSL. And that committee, and we should probably say this explicitly in here, that committee said that, basically said, the thinking about income elasticity should be coordinated with thinking about the base VSL estimates. So I think that piece of framing is not in here right now. It needs to be much clearer. We can then go on to say that setting aside that issue of needing to update the base VSL estimates and make sure income elasticity estimates are consistent with whatever we do there, or whatever the agency does there. We can't still walk through the things that are in this response to clarify some of the issues, but it's not all clear to me that this should be a separate effort. I don't know whether Joe agrees with me or not. I know we disagree on some of the details, but big picture, I don't know.
Let's hear from Joe.
Yeah, so Lisa, I think big picture, I mean, I think everyone agrees, and by everyone I mean I think all the economists at EPA agree that this VSL is dramatically out of date. The most recently published paper that is used that goes into the EPA estimate is from 1991. Yeah. The methods used in these studies, whether it's the revealed preference or stated preference methods, just don't cut it today. The data wouldn't cut it today. You know, no one uses any of the risk measures from these papers post 1992 because BLS realized there was a systematic bias in how they measured occupational risk used in those papers and came up with a census of fatal occupational injury. So we clearly need to say we need to update the VSL. I think it makes sense for us to say it ought to be, you know, the income elasticity also has changed since the 1990s. The measure they use in BenMAP, central estimate 0.4 is from a review in the 1990s. I think we should discuss this literature, and I think we are generally in agreement on what the appropriate income elasticity should be, given sort of where the literature is. I think we may quibble a little bit about what's the appropriate range or how we characterize uncertainty, but I think in general, a unit elasticity, income elasticity makes sense, given the literature, and something we can support with the literature. So I think we should recommend that as a way to like start getting things moving in the right direction, but emphasize the importance of making this consistent with an updating on VSL. I also think it's worth thinking through like how we're making sure this is consistent with how EPA is thinking about income elasticity in the VSL in the context of the social cost of carbon. Right. So this is where we get into some of the weeds on like, what's the right measure of income? Where I think Lisa and I are on slightly different pages. I know from the social cost of carbon work, which is just going through, they've just gotten the comments back from peer review. But what they presented in that November report is to use a unit income elasticity like what we are suggesting here, but they're applying it to GDP per capita. And so that's different than if we're using sort of labor earnings here. I think we can sort of talk some about this. It gets back to our previous conversation an hour or so ago about shared socioeconomic pathways and what measures are actually used in that projection and whether we want to maintain internal consistency with that. I think we are generally of the view that, like, so long as you're using incredibly outdated data, you ought to think about how you're making that adjustment, at least in a consistent way. I mean, as we note in here, for a given year of reduced premature mortality risk in the future, depending on which IRA you looked at, you're actually using a different measure of VSL because of different assumptions on when they started to make the income adjustment, right? So there's like little things like that. I think we can agree, make that consistent. But I think I agree, like, we just need to emphasize for them. They've heard this before, that they need to update the VSL. I think, you know, we can hear from Pete about the views within OAR on this, but my sense is within NCEE, they would like to address this issue. I think they know from the conversations we had when we did the economic guidelines review in 2020 that this is outdated and it needs to be remedied. So I think highlighting it here would perhaps help spur them and moving forward with the process to update the VSL.
Can I mention one thing that's related to what Joe's saying? Maureen Crapper and Alan Krupnick are working on a paper on VSL that I think is about to hit publication. I believe they have in there an appendix that has every single EPA and Science Advisory Board review of VSL issues. And I think hopefully that'll be out. It's not citable right now, but hopefully it'll be out within the next few weeks. And we can just refer to that and say, look, there's been an awful lot of water under the bridge on these issues. It's time to bite the bullet and move forward.
Pete, you want to weigh in on this?
What may not be the right word, but let me say that if the I recognize that this is a fine line. We consider the base value of the VSL to be beyond our purview, and what we do with that to be within our purview, such as how we adjust it to bring it up to something current, right? If the committee, if the panel thinks that those need to be considered jointly or that changes should be joint, one outcome of that might be that the agency decides that we don't want to change the base and thus don't want to do anything to change the status quo. And so with that in mind, I would encourage y'all to, if you think that they should be considered jointly, to also provide a recommendation for how we might proceed without addressing the base value.
Yeah, the problem, Pete, is that we've been down this path before. Sorry, I don't want to put Neil on the spot, but I understand the problem, and I think that this is a policy decision for EPA, because either we can tell you how to update them kind of elasticity estimates, and you'll end up with a VSL that's much higher than the other agencies. Right now, your VSL is in the range of other agencies, and also in the range of Kip Viscusi's publication bias adjusted estimates. Or we can say to you, or maybe we just pose it as a choice, that you do them both jointly. And my expectation is you won't end up quite as out of line with what other people think is an appropriate estimate. But maybe we just need to be more explicit about that.
All right. It sounds to me like maybe we are all saying similar things, which is that there is this political choice of who gets to make this decision. You know, it's kind of like, we're not going to tell OMB what the right discount rate is, right? It's just, you know, it's up to somebody else. But that the science is very clear, saying you don't want to just change one thing at a time, because then you get things that are internally inconsistent, and that's not a sensible thing to do. So maybe if we just point those things out, that you could change nothing, or you could change multiple things at once to develop an improved framework, that provides clear guidance on what the options are, right? But that we probably would not recommend changing just a portion of this, which could lead to problematic results. Okay, I had said, maybe I'll come to regret this, but I had said that we would use the last half hour of this meeting to try to prioritize what goes into the 3-page letter to the administrator. However, even if I sort of wave my magic blue hand like we used to have on Zoom and say we're done with 4, that means we still didn't talk about 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I do think it's very important to get the committee's input on both prioritization of the recommendations and any remaining issues. I think it might be easier to do some of the remaining issues kind of offline when we don't necessarily need the entire group. If there are certain people who are particularly interested in, question 7 or something, that doesn't mean necessarily we have the whole panel. So if people have very pressing issues that they would like to raise in front of the whole panel on any of the remaining questions, then, you could please maybe put a message in the chat and we'll make sure that there's time for those. Otherwise, I would propose that we do begin this other task of trying to figure out what we think are really key issues amongst our recommendations. On the bright side, we made what I would consider relatively minor changes to the bolded text from the first 4 questions. So we have a good, we will change some of the tiers in response to some comments from Christy and Enid, I think, and on some of those questions on number 3. There were a few other, slight tweaks, but in general, I think we could consider the bulleted points from the first 5 as, a good source of material to draw from. And what I would like to do is, if people need a couple minutes to go look through all of the different options, that's fine. But people were also involved in creating all of these and hopefully have read the ones from their section. So maybe what we could do is have people propose things that they think are really important, crucially important. Everything's important, but nothing that's not elevated will be lost, but what really should be elevated up to the summary letter that goes to the administrator. So why don't people in the background think about that a little bit, and then we'll call on the whole panel to weigh in. And maybe at the moment I see we're getting some hands, which I don't know are about whether this is a terrible way to proceed or they're suggestions for the letter. But why don't we hear from Rob and then Peter, please?
I just have a question about how we set these priorities. There are the sort of more interesting things, the more interesting issues require some additional work, I think. That's what's engaged people, what people are excited about from our end. And then there are things that seem obvious to us. We've given them a recommendation, and I sort of assume that they'll take the recommendation. The question I have is, do we, from the standpoint of an appropriate strategy, is it better to focus on the interesting things that would require some work, or are there things that we feel strongly about that are straightforward that we should have in the recommendations?
Excellent question, Peter. That's Rob. Sorry, I was looking at the next hand. Maybe we can get some. Why don't we take Peter's question, and then we'll see if maybe some of those who have more experience with this, or Holly or others from EPA would. I'm not sure if that's you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's no one answer to that question. So, for instance, if there was something that was actionable but was fundamentally critical to this peer review, even if it wasn't big picture and super exciting, it may be worthy of putting in. But in general, I agree with the lean of your question. I mean, I think that you should highlight interesting and important items, the things that might be helpful moving forward for the next iteration of the tool. But it's a great question, and it's the right frame of mind, but there's really not one answer to it. So I hope that helps a little. I agree with you. It should be, forward thinking, forward looking, but it could very well be appropriate that something that's a little more mechanical needs to be highlighted up to the letter if you all feel it's important.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I actually had a concern about one of the recommendations in 5D. Is this an okay time to flag that?
Yeah, please.
So 5D, the charge question is just in particular, it's about the shape of the concentration response function and attendant uncertainties, especially concentrations near and below what are observed in epi studies, basically. And one of the recommendations in there was about as a sensitivity to look at the short-term epi results for places that are at low concentrations. And the concern that I had, I don't, maybe I missed this in our meeting in Research Triangle Park, but the concern I had is that, that seems, I guess when we think about upper and lower bounds, we should generally be, pretty broad in terms of what we think about in upper and lower bounds. But the short-term mortality numbers, I think, generally tend to be like an order of magnitude smaller than the long-term. That just seems like a really low bound to me. And for something where, it's at the lower end of the concentration range, which is often pretty important for policy analysis, I was just concerned that was like, potentially throwing away an important chunk of benefits in probably an overly cautious sort of lower bound.
This is in 5B, Peter?
5D.
Thank you.
Sorry, D as in dog. Sorry. I should have said that in the
Page 33 in the PDF.
Yeah, and it's the second part, the tier 2 sensitivity analysis to incorporate results from studies between mortality and short-term air pollution exposures. And then that idea is, I think it's the last paragraph in 5D in the main text.
Right. Ted, I see you're on the line. Do you have any thoughts about the point that Peter just raised? I think you were in charge of that section, if I'm...
Yeah, so this came up, I can't remember who shipped it to me, but this actually, I think, has more to do with the shape than the actual value of it, because the question itself had to do with the shape of the concentration function, or the concentration response function. And so I'd have to look back about who sent in some of the thought on using the short-term responses. So it's specifically in response to the shape, not to the actual value, I think.
Okay, thanks, Ted. And at minimum, then it sounds to me like we should clarify that, because when Peter just brought this up and I look back, I thought the same thing, that maybe this is the value. Nick?
Yeah, I think I was the one who sent that suggestion in, and I was trying to think about how we could get a lower bound that was above 0. If the alternative is that there's no evidence, and so we would implicitly assign a value of 0, how could we look to the existing scientific evidence at levels of low concentrations? And so I completely agree with Peter that it's likely to be a conservatively lower bound. And the question is, what's the alternative? If it's implicitly to assign it a value of 0, a lower bound might be more informative. But I don't feel strongly about keeping it in or cutting it out if people don't think it's useful.
Okay, maybe those involved in this area, I think I don't have an immediate feeling on that either. Might require a little thought about the options here. So maybe Peter, thank you for flagging that. I think that's a good issue. I think as the way it's written now seems insufficiently clear what we're getting at. So maybe Ted and Nick and myself, Peter, anybody else who's interested can ponder that a little bit more, and think about the options for the lower bound, or and if we use this as the option, which is currently perhaps our only candidate, then maybe we can clarify, at least at minimum we can clarify a bit what we're trying to do, and point out that we think that this might be a very conservative approach, but it might be better than an alternative of zero.
Well, we've got other options, and that I think the big, the first part of that gets into another option on the shape function, is you can just use the additional ones that are currently out there.
Okay, so maybe then what we want to do is not have such an explicit recommendation here up at the top that says, hey, do it this way and use the short term. And maybe what we want to have is something more along the lines of EPA can consider multiple options, right? And then the text itself will describe that there are various choices there. Okay, that's great. Peter, thank you again for bringing that up. That's an important revision. Any other comments on any of the questions we didn't get to? Please say so. Otherwise, maybe we can get to the ambiguity that Rob brought up and Tom confirmed, is that there are a lot of things that are important, and there are things that are simple and things that require changes and things that are exciting and interesting intellectually and scientifically, as well as things that EPA should just really do because they can, and it's better. So we've got, I don't know how many, if you go through almost all the sub bullets have recommendations, so that probably is on the order of 30, and we probably want to pick, say, the top 10 or so. Maybe no more than half of them would fit in a 3-page letter. Any suggestions?
So I cut and pasted the tier 1 recommendations into a separate file, which is on the meeting website. It's 14 tier 1 recommendations that might provide a base for prioritizing.
Thank you, Ollie. Okay, that's a great starting point. So if we have, and how long, what is that roughly?
It's 1 page, but it's just,
right.
It would need a lot of narrative and context, and we would need to wean it down to a smaller number of recommendations for the letter to the administrator.
Okay, perfect. So maybe then.
But if you're on the meeting webpage, you got to scroll down to meeting materials. It's the only attachment you'll find right there.
Okay, so 14 recommendations currently. So I realize that people might want to add to that, which is quite possible. But also we should consider maybe what is important in tier 1, but doesn't necessarily rise to the level of something that we feel is really important to get to the administrator and the top officials in this letter. Now, Lisa? You're muted, Lisa.
After all this time on Zoom. I was going to make this easy and suggest that all the things that have to do with question 4, we just focus on this idea that you need to update the values for non-fatal effects and roll that into one recommendation, because it seems to me that although the lag stuff is important, it does not affect the values as much as moving from what they're doing now to a willingness to pay estimate. And although the income elasticity stuff is important, as we were just saying, there is this issue of linking it to what they do with VSL. So I think that that might cut out, that might get us down to 1, 2, 3. I'm not sure, but that might get us down to certainly fewer recommendations. Drops at least 3, I think.
Yeah, combining them would be great.
Yeah,
I wouldn't really combine them. I'd emphasize the one that has to do with updating estimates for non-fatal effects, and I would drop the other ones from the summary, because I don't think they're going to affect the end results of what you get out of BenMAP as much. In case of the more detailed things on valuation and the lag and on income elasticity, I think there's some bigger issues there than what we can address.
Okay, great. Others have thoughts? I've just downloaded this and have the 14 recommendations, which would definitely be condensed a little on some of the economic ones. I don't know if other people have had a chance to look at this. Mike?
I just scanned it really quickly. I again want to put a plug in for maintaining the functionality of current BenMAP moving forward. So that's more of a program issue, a programming issue, but I think it's important to highlight that even if it's not live now, it's a very high priority for the agency to build that functionality in so we don't lose any abilities that we currently have.
Well, and Mike, thanks also for raising that, because since I put together these bulleted points for the first 5, but not the last 5, we don't actually mention BenMAP explicitly. And so clearly there is more to be said about BenMAP, and that's certainly one point that can be raised about BenMAP, but I'm certain there are other things we want to say too.
I think there is a whole host of things. You know, basically the software is in the web format is a great start, but it's not mature. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, whether it's user documentation, just ease of use, being able to click on links live, you know, making sure the functionality is maintained, being able to put our own, you know, concentration response functions into it for advanced users. There's a whole host of things there that I think you know, can all be wrapped up under the idea of maintaining current functionality. And you know, the software in the web format is currently, you know, not a beta version, but it needs to mature still.
Okay, we do want to, I wonder if we could get a quick sense of the room virtually as it is, while it's, I think there's a sense from our previous discussions that what Mike just said is the feeling of the panel, that there is a lot that's not there in the online version, and that we want that to be there, that there's a sense the documentation is not clear, et cetera. But for what BenMAP does do, is there a sense that it is fit for regulatory purposes, which is the question that Pete posed to us at the beginning of this call, which is a much more limited, you know, you don't need to be able to put in your own concentration response functions for EPA to use it. So is there a sense in the room, is there a sense from anybody, rather, let me put it the opposite way, is there a sense that it is not yet fit for regulatory purposes the same way that it is not, you know, necessarily fit for scientific researchers? Okay, I don't see that at the moment, so that's good to know. If anybody does feel that way and hasn't had time to chime in, please follow up with an email, but otherwise let me return to Ted. Did you want to say something specifically on that?
Yeah, just, I will say that I wasn't sure, given how it was written up, how it does the uncertainty analysis, if it's truly correct. It was just, I could not pick that up. I couldn't ascertain that from the write-up. So that could just be clarification. That was it.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful. Okay, I'm going to go through the folks who have their hands raised, and we'll get some more comments here on whatever it is you want to bring up. So we're going to have Peter, then Jonathan Bonacor, then Jonathan Patz, and then Rob are the 4 hands I see at the moment. Peter, please.
I guess in terms of things that we talked a lot about about BenMAP, the tool that maybe is worth highlighting. I mean, we talked a lot about BenMAP gets used for regulatory purposes. It also gets used for research purposes. It's an incredibly valuable, essentially, service that EPA provides to the research community, having this tool. And something about that, both lauding the success of BenMAP, but also sort of pleading that, you know, the second purpose for research get the priority and the resources that it deserves because it's so valuable.
That's great. Thank you. That's a nicer way to put, or a nice way to put this kind of overarching review, like I mentioned at the beginning about when you comment on a paper.
Yeah.
It's a good way to put what we think of BenMAP. And it fits with the comment Mike raised too about keeping it useful for researchers. Jonathan, please. B.
I think similar to what Pinos have said is that it would be nice in the future if BenMAP could move toward a community model similar to like what CMAC or one of those is doing. I'm thinking both in terms of the research community and also making EPA's job easier as far as making sure that BenMAP continues to be like more or less caught up with the science. Just because if you have a whole community that can make updates, it's a lot easier to pull your favorite update 5 years from now than have us do a whole meeting and decide, have EPA like change 6 things.
Great. Yeah, that seems to me too consistent with the discussion we had down here in North Carolina when we met. Thank you, Jonathan. How about Jonathan P now?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask where we are as far as the tier 1, 2, and 3. The list of tier 1 to me looks good, and I would simply second the recommendation to take all the tier 1 recommendations as we have them, and those would comprise those would get into the executive summary, because I think there is a good. I think these are all good.
Jonathan, we're actually not going to have an executive summary. It's just a letter to the administrator. We're constrained to about 3 pages.
Yeah.
So that's why we're talking about cutting this down to a smaller list.
Right. Okay. So then for the 3-page letter, I think how we've rated these as far as importance, I agree with. I don't have any disagreements with how we have our rankings, and so I would propose that we take the tier 1s and put those into the letter.
Great. Okay, I think we will start with those, and with Lisa's suggestion about the economic ones, I think we might be able to fit most of what we have in the collection that Holly has put together. So I think we're on our way. Rob, please.
Yeah, maybe I was going to suggest some highest priority ones, but if we're gonna include all the tier 1s, then I.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have room to include all the tier 1s because it's going to be too long.
Yeah.
So suggestions about higher priorities are great.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's not specific to BenMAP so much, but I thought recommendation 1 and 3 they're really important, I think, to updating EPA's approach. They'll be work, but they're actionable. So I would make those recommendations that we'd want to prioritize.
I agree with that. I especially the ones taking studies beyond the US and Canada. I thought that was a very high priority one.
Great. Okay, so we can, as we edit to trim into whatever will fit into 3 pages, that's good to know to make sure that we those would not be on the cutting block first. Peter, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe a question for the EPA folks, but if they have any sort of sense for like, are there certain issues that really need, more than others, administrator attention? It seems to me that, we have some high priority stuff that is, or that we put as tier 1, but is sort of a little bit more mechanical, and maybe Pete and Neil are like, yeah, this is important. We're going to do it. We know how to do it. It's sort of straightforward, right? It's not. Whereas it seems like there's some stuff that's more, every time this morning when we said kind of policy judgment, stuff about VSL, stuff about, moving towards willingness to pay for disease rather than cost of illness, things like that are those seem to be the things that probably more valuable for the letter to the administrator, but I don't know if people from the EPA have sort of a sense for where the administrator really sort of comes into the process here.
I'll take a stab at that, and I'll say our management broadly. Yeah, so the VSL is obviously, the VSL base value is obviously a decision being made by our management at an institutional level. And that's clearly something that the panelists feel is highly important. So that's an obvious one to highlight. I think the two other things that I think are that we would think it's important for our management to be aware what the committee thinks are. One is this question of fitness for regulatory purposes. And the other is this question of the, frankly, from the institute, I think probably from, my boss's viewpoint, sort of secondary, but nationally important use of this broader use by the research community, and highlighting that. The tension is that this is developed for research purposes, and it's sort of convenient that it has so many broader uses, right? And all of these things that y'all and BenMAP, the legacy desktop version, has been developed over close to 20 years now. I guess this one over 10, right? Right, and that's just a lot of years of annual funding adding features, and most of what y'all have suggested is really just stuff, a funding issue, right? And so that's a decision that'll be made above the staff pay grade, but that's clearly something that the panel thinks is important and is a decision for the staff. A lot of the things like a lot of what you have discussed, the willingness to pay, for example, I think that's well understood, and our staff will move there as we can. Let me flip to my notes. I think, yeah, there's lots of important things that y'all have named that our management will view as technical implementation details that are better fit for staff. So I think those are the biggest ones.
Great. I think that's helpful for prioritization. Sorry, I cut somebody off. Holly?
I'm just going to ask Pete to clarify one thing. The VSL issue, I don't think, my understanding is that is not an Office of Air and Radiation decision. That's a decision that is the National Center on Environmental Economics and the administrator level. So while it's right, you can't update the VSL just for OAR. It needs to be an EPA-wide decision. So there's a different focus there, right?
Absolutely. And this is an Office of Air and Radiation project. And NCE will be reading the report. Right.
Right. Well, so hopefully this will go to the top levels, and so maybe that is worth including there. Thank you very much, Pete. I realize we have 2 more hands up and we have 2 more minutes. So I'm going to ask you to be quick, but can we hear from Scott and then Chris, please?
So briefly, one of the things that is the panel thinks regarding regulatory use is that 12 kilometers, which was not something we were asked about, has already been selected for regulatory use, and most of the panel thinks that's not sufficient for any scientific or regulatory use at this time. And so just pointing out that was one thing you didn't ask us that we found to be important.
Thank you. I think that my sense was we definitely advocated for higher resolution, especially when dealing with distributional impacts. I'm not sure that I got the impression that it was insufficient for regulatory purposes, but it definitely could be improved. Let's get, in the interest of time, Chris.
Yeah, so kind of one overarching thing is, I think, perhaps the importance of kind of first-class support for distributional analysis. And so that includes, the resolution issues. It includes the the demographic data information regarding, endpoints and baseline diseases and population counts. And it also would involve actually being able to do that in BenMAP, right? And my understanding, I haven't double checked, but my understanding was that the BenMAP web version is not currently able to look at things by all the different things by race and ethnicity. And I may be wrong about that, but if that's true, or by different demographic characteristics, if that's true, that may be one thing that kind of would push it a little bit back towards not being ready for regulatory analysis, especially given the current administration's emphasis on, benefits accruing to certain communities.
Okay, I guess maybe we can clarify, there is the ideal to optimally inform regulatory analysis, and then there's what's available, which might be what you use, and we quantify things we can, and there are others that we can't, and we still regulate. So maybe this falls into that area, as it's useful, but can be improved. I think we are out of time. I want to thank everybody for a very productive discussion, and I think we did manage to address both our overarching general comments to EPA, which Holly and I can work on. I think we have enough information to produce now a draft letter, which then everybody can comment on, including all of this discussion for the last half an hour or so on what are really the top priorities and what's most valuable to EPA, which we'll put in there. We have worked for several individual committee members, review panel members, that is, to make some relatively minor revisions to the draft document, which I think we can go ahead. And so again, thank you everybody for the robust engagement in drafting the document and in this 3-hour long meeting today. Maybe I could turn it back to Holly to formally sign us off.
Right. Thank you very much, Drew. It was a great discussion. We will follow up by email, and we are adjourned. Thank you.